the way of awakening summoner, the way of overwhelming overlord, the way of the scope, sniper, the way of the void, darkness, elementalist, shadow assassin, umbra monk, the way of the wanton, sorcerer, the way of the war cry, war magician, flight magician and nautical magician, the way of the warped, demonologist, the way of the warrant, bounty hunter, the way of the wary, battle visionary, the way of the watchful, conflict sentinel, the way of the wayfarer, street savage and related subprofessions, the way of the whisper, assassin, the way of the wicked, necromancer, the way of the wild, beastmaster, the way of the word, prophet and dark prophet, the way of the worthy, omnis practitioner, the way of the wretched, bane master and death whisperer, the way of the wry, revolutionary, the way of validity tech, the way of vindication, phantasm ninja, the way of wages, mercenary, the way of wandering, tech druid, the way of wands, enchanter, the way of war, warrior, the way of warding, alchemist, the way of warmth, fire, elementalist, smolder assassin, flame monk, the way of waste, technomancer, the way of waver, spellsong minstrel, the way of waves, water elementalist, shallow assassin and brine monk, the way of wealth, ringkeeper, the way of weaponry, engineer, the way of weaving, energy magus, the way of welfare, shaman, the way of whirling, blade dancer, the way of white light, spectrum mage, the way of wielding, martial artist and gladiator, the way of willpower, warlock and arcane warrior, the way of wind, air elementalist, smother assassin and squall monk, the way of winding, temporal meddler, the way of wisdom wizard, the way of wit sage, the way of witchcraft witch, the way of woe, brujo bruja, the way of wonder, grand illusionist and fighting illusionist, the way of wood, earth elementalist, sandstorm assassin, knoll monk, the way of worship, hierophant, monk and paladin, the way of wrath, chaos monk, chaos knight and priest of chaos, the way of writ, conquest inscriber, the way within mystic, the way of the warped, the way of the warrant, the way of the wary, the way of the watchful, the way of the wayfarer, the way of the whisper, the way of the wicked, the way of the wild, the way of the word, the way of the worthy, the way of the wretched, the way of the wry, the way of validity, the way of vindication, the way of wages, the way of wandering, the way of wands, the way of war, the way of warding, the way of warmth, the way of waste, the way of waver, the way of waves, the way of wealth, the way of weaponry, the way of weaving, the way of welfare, the way of whirling, the way of white light, the way of wielding, the way of willpower, the way of wind, the way of winding, the way of wisdom, the way of wit, the way of witchcraft, the way of woe, the way of wonder, the way of wood, the way of worship, the way of wrath, the way of writ, the way within.